How Ozark should have ended. The final season of Ozark recently came to a conclusive end. Well, inconclusive in the sense that it was almost left up to interpretation. I found Ozark Season 4 Part 1 to be an incredible piece of television. So much so that I feel Part 2 almost had too much to live up to. With that being said, I thought I'd put forward how I feel and a possible option of how Ozark Season 4 Part 2 and the entirety of the show could have ended. So let's jump in. Here is how Ozark should have ended. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers from the previous seasons of the show. Season 4 Part 2 has ended in a way that has caused some discussion around if it was the right direction for the show to go in. The writers went with the direction of the birds potentially getting out of everything alive, despite the fact that the leader of the cartel was murdered in front of their very eyes. They were screwing Omar Navarro over, along with many other people, and they survived everything that was coming their way. An option for an alternative ending would have changed at the point of Wendy coming out of the clinic. At this point, we saw Wendy was in a far better mental state than she was earlier on in the show. This was off the back of Jonah and Charlotte going to live with her father, the Bird Foundation almost falling to pieces due to Claire not wanting to work with the cartel following Harvey being killed, and the life in Chicago drifting further and further away. The family had the gala approaching, and Jonah and Charlotte had changed their mind on moving away, following the altercation between Ruth and their grandfather with the revelation of what he was like. Wendy was discharged from the clinic, and for the first time in an extremely long while, we saw the birds, happy, all together, and on the verge of getting their life back. It was a tone and mood that was quite alien to the show, and the perfect moment for disaster to strike and for the plan to not go ahead. We got a glimpse of what could have been when the car accident happened, and this is then when I think the direction could have changed. Instead of them all getting out alive and implying that the birds are the immortal, untouchable family that they're made out to be, I think Wendy should have died in the accident, in an extremely dramatic way. Why? She's the figurehead of the family and always drives things forward. She spent the entirety of the last season working towards getting a life in Chicago, and also striving to be the face of what would be the most powerful family in the Midwest. She put that above all other priorities, even her family, and it would have seemed appropriate for that to have been taken away from her following her behavior throughout the entirety of the show. This would have had a couple of direct impacts that would have altered the final third. We would have seen the gala crumble due to Wendy being absent. We would have also seen the Bird Foundation crumble from within. Wendy's the figurehead of the family and is the only person who tends to drive it forward, leading with negotiations, relationships, and development. This would make the safety plan that they had in place to go back to Chicago redundant, and the plan would fall to pieces. Marty, the man who had spent the entirety of the show putting Ruth and other people first, would have the lasting words of Wendy saying how he neglected his family and thinks of others first, constantly going round in his head. Despite the fact that he did finally step up in the last episode when he was needed, he'd be viewing it as too little too late, and be grieving the loss of his wife. We've not seen Marty experience grief before, so it'd be a performance that I would imagine would stand out for sure. Although Wendy would be dead, Claire would still be locked into a deal with the cartel and continue to supply each other on the basis of the contract that was previously put in place. With Wendy now deceased, Claire would have no obligation to the birds, and after receiving a similar threat to what she did at the gala, but this time in the office or on the phone, she would drop Ruth into it along with the birds. With Marty none the wiser to this happening, Ruth would have still gone on to face off with Camilla and ultimately get killed. Ruth's death was something that I was a fan of. The calm, collected nature of her and the acceptance of what was going to happen was a moment that should be left untouched. We got every ounce of Ruth in that final scene, so I'd leave it as it was. It was inevitable that Ruth was going to die in the show. It's poetic in the sense that the Langmores amount to nothing. Even the first clean one in 5 generations, which was Ruth, still couldn't escape it. And the fact that she died in the place where she was building new beginnings, and is also quite literally a graveyard for the Langmores, suited it perfectly. With Claire dropping the birds into it too, we'd see Camilla arrive at their house, and we'd be led to believe that she'd kill Marty for being there and lying to her, along with Jonah and Charlotte as punishment. However, she wouldn't go on to kill him. With Ruth now dead, Camilla would still need somebody to move money from the Missouri Belle, and that would sit with Marty still. Camilla would understand how good Marty is, and the value that he holds to them as an asset, and in turn lock him into a deal that would essentially mean that he'd never be able to escape the Ozark and get that life in Chicago. He would essentially now be considered an enemy of the cartel, and if he tried to escape, he would be killed. This would leave him stuck with the only option of continuing his work, being killed by the cartel, or taking himself, stuck in the place where his life was uprooted to and haunted by the ghosts of the trouble and people that he'd lost. From here, if we're still sticking to the original narrative, we'd have seen the private investigator Mel have arrived at the house, still obsessed with the case of Ben who'd gone missing, and an unhealthy obsession with the birds. But this time it didn't matter. Mel would be unaware that Wendy was killed, so Marty would inform him. And with Wendy now dead, he'd almost have no hold over the Bird family. Even if the truth did come out, Marty would still be in his grieving state and mourning the fact that he'd never be able to leave. He would almost be mirroring the state of Ruth that we'd seen earlier on in the season. He'd then go on to channel all of the cold-hearted, murderous, rage-driven mannerisms that he'd witnessed from the cartel and what people had expressed to him over the years, and he'd utilize that on Mel. Marty would have the final moment in the show and sink the downfall even harder. He got his family into this mess all those years ago, and on the brink of getting their life back, it would have all been taken away. The very thing that Marty didn't want to become, and considering he spent the majority of the show being the good one, so to speak, and he'd pull the trigger on a route where he'd quite truly not be going back. We saw him do this in Season 2 with Mason threatening Wendy, so we know that that's his trigger point, so to speak. Wendy would be his weakness even beyond the grave. With that being done, it would cut to black with a single take shot of Marty's empty, emotionless blank face, panning back through the house, over the house to a view of the lake that they overlook and is poignant to the show, cementing his place and that he'll never be able to get out of this mess unless he essentially takes himself. It would be a bleak ending and one that I think would be fitting to the overall tone of the show, rather than leaving it up to interpretation for us to decide whether or not they get their life back in Chicago. But that's just one option. There are so many different directions where the show could have gone in this season. But I thought I'd see what could have potentially been tweaked by keeping it true to the overall narrative and in line with what the previous episodes were building up to. If you want to see a review of the overall season, then feel free to hit the I button, along with what I thought Ruth's hallucinations meant throughout the entirety of Season 4 Part 2. There's a ton of Ozark content on the channel, so feel free to take a look. What did you think of the ending of Ozark? Did you think it was good? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.